Hello, and welcome to New Scientist Weekly, your curated selection of the week's science stories. I'm Timothy Revel in London.
And I'm Christy Taylor in New York. This week on the podcast, a frankly delicious lineup. We've got how to make butter out of carbon, a soup of digital life brought to you by Google, and a new hormone that may strengthen our bones.
Plus, what cosmic rays have to do with the stock market. But first, we're kicking off with what is really quite an extraordinary archaeological find from the Siberian permafrost. It's a woolly mammoth fossil, which of course we found before, but this one is in a kind of beef-jerky-like state. And that means that despite being thousands of years old, the DNA inside it is remarkably well preserved. Wildlife reporter Corinne Wetzel is here to tell us more about this amazing story and what it could mean for efforts to bring back mammoths from extinction. Hi, Corinne.
Hi.
Welcome to the pod. So talk us through this one. How does one actually go about finding a woolly mammoth fossil?
So let's start in northeast Siberia, which is where this all began. So Siberia is a really great place to look for things like woolly mammoths or any sort of ancient animal remains because it's frozen. Animals have been trapped in permafrost there for thousands of years, which makes it a really good place to go and look for this sort of thing. And a few years ago, scientists were exploring a cave system in Siberia, looking for mammoths, whatever they could find. And the way they do this is actually pretty wild. They take basically like a fire hose and hose off this frozen earth and sort of see what pops out. Wow. And they found this huge piece of mammoth skin about 1 meter wide, and it was still covered in hair and everything.
Oh, delightfully gruesome, and that's just an amazing method for finding them. So eventually they get this thing out of the ice, or 1 meter of it. Then what happens?
Right. So their first thought was, how do we sample this thing for DNA? Because scientists have found mammoths before, of course, but they've only ever been able to sort of get these little snippets of DNA from the tissue. And that's because after an animal dies, our DNA just sort of starts unraveling, kind of like a shoelace without the little plastic tip. So before, we've only had these little tiny snippets, but the real surprise this time was that researchers found whole intact chromosomes. So we're talking millions of base pairs instead of just snippets of hundreds. And because the 3D architecture of the chromosome was preserved, they could even tell what genes were active or inactive, which has never before been possible. For example, they could see that genes related to hair growth were much more active in woolly mammoths than their close relatives, the Asian elephants, which makes sense because they're quite a bit hairier.
Well, this sounds like a biologist's dream to be able to actually see like what genes are expressed in something that's been dead for so long. So what was so special about this specimen? Why did its DNA not unravel like the other mammoth remains that they found before?
So we probably have the Siberian permafrost to thank for that. The mammoth sort of dried and froze out at the same time over thousands of years, which basically turned it into a giant piece of mammoth jerky. It was basically freeze-dried by nature.
Amazing. And I know you're a vegetarian, so this is probably an interesting prospect for you, Corinne. Does freeze-dried mammoth DNA hold up better over time then?
So that was their theory. But of course, they had to test it, which is where this research gets really bizarre. So they started by making their own mock mammoth jerky using, store-bought dehydrator in the lab. They were drying all these pieces of beef, which is, of course, easier to get your hands on than mammoth these days. And they were doing all this to see how the freeze-dried beef held up over time. Was the chromosomal structure able to be preserved through all these different tests of time and stress? Because they couldn't exactly replicate, 52,000 years of permafrost, ice, weight pressing on this mammoth. They got a bit creative. They took the mock mammoth jerky and they ran over it with a car. They shot it with a shotgun. And they also had a former Major League Baseball player throw a fastball at it. And as they suspected, the beef jerky sort of broke apart. But on the nanoscale, at the cellular level, the DNA and the chromosomes stayed perfectly intact, which sort of confirmed their theory that the beef jerkification preserved this DNA in this remarkable way.
I mean, what are the chances that a Major League Baseball player threw a fastball at a woolly mammoth? I mean, it seems fairly low. Like, with all of those things, they seem so specific and kind of weird. Is there any reason why they chose those stunts, or were they just kind of gimmicks? Like, how useful was that part?
Right. So when I chatted with the researchers, they definitely admitted that they had a lot of fun doing this. But they did have to find ways to apply, huge amounts of pressure and stress to this mock mammoth meat. So, why not run it over with a car or have a baseball player throw a pitch at it? I think that one in particular, they were like, yeah, we were just having a bit of fun. But all in the name of science.
Yeah, why not? I'm sure you'll remember a few months ago we were talking to Michael LePage on this show about Colossal, and they're that startup that has the really ambitious goal of bringing a baby mammoth into the world by 2028. And at the time, they were talking about this kind of big breakthrough related to stem cells, which might be useful. But underlying it all, which Michael kept reiterating, was that they couldn't make woolly mammoths. They could only make kind of woolly mammoth-like elephants because we didn't have a full picture of a mammoth genome. All the genomes that had been sequenced were riddled with gaps. Does this change that? Could we now have a future where we have real woolly mammoths?
Yeah, so this has filled in a lot of those gaps in missing information. So it gives us a ton more information than, we've ever had before. It's the equivalent of having sort of a few paragraphs to the entire book now. But that doesn't mean that we will have sort of, quote unquote, real woolly mammoths anytime soon, or it might never be possible, as you mentioned that Michael wrote about. So knowing what genes are more active in a woolly mammoth versus, let's say, an Asian elephant is important in terms of how do we gene edit an elephant to grow a bunch of hair or sound like a mammoth or be really tolerant to a super cold environment. But of course, it all comes back to, a hairy elephant is not a true woolly mammoth, and we're still in that place. But what I'm really much more excited about with this research is what it means for other paleontology discoveries. So the experts I spoke with suspect there's a ton more jerkified animal remains out there, maybe even some in museum collections that they wouldn't even have to go unearth, that they can sample and now get this 3D chromosomal structure and this level of detail that was never before possible.
Amazing. Thank you very much,
Corinne. Vegetarians, would you eat the mammoth jerky?
I think that I would eat cell-cultured mammoth jerky. It's not going to be an absolute no. I'm open to it.
I feel like
What
it's
do you
not the vegetarianism. It's more like the eating one of the few mammoth fossils we have. Seems like a bit
Ethics.
Seems a bit off.
Right, yeah. Taking away future research for the point of a snack probably isn't great.
All right, Tim, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Was it cereal, yogurt, maybe some buttery toast?
Yes to all of the above.
All right, well, what if I told you there was a startup that was making actual butter for your toast, but without the help of any cows?
Yeah, I have butter like that. It's called margarine.
No, we are actually talking about something even more radical. No farming whatsoever, no vegetables involved.
Okay.
So here to tell us more is New Scientist environment reporter Maddie Cuff. Hey, Maddie.
Hello.
All right, Maddie, for the big reveal, what is this new substance and do we even call it butter?
Hello. Well, we're calling it butter, but I think probably a lot of people would insist it's actually got nothing to do with butter because, like you said, it doesn't involve cows, doesn't use any farmland, doesn't use any vegetable oils, doesn't even have any microbes involved in making it. This is a completely industrial butter.
So synthetic food, which isn't exactly a new idea, right?
Yeah, people have been talking about synthetic food for literally hundreds of years. So we can go right back to the 1890s, where advances in chemistry meant that scientists were predicting the end of agriculture and just a complete switch to synthetic food. And there was a big leap that came in 1937 when German researchers were working on ways to make butter from coal, which sounds delicious. And that actually did get put to use during the Second World War to feed German troops. But ultimately, it was a super inefficient way of making food. You needed something like 60 kilograms of coal for 1 kilogram of butter. So that got scrapped after the Second World War. But if we jump forward to today's world, there are some new incentives for us to look again at making synthetic foods part of our diet, not least if we think about climate change and biodiversity loss. So there's a US startup called Savor that I spoke to recently, and they're working on a modern version of the coal butter process, which essentially is taking carbon to make an industrial fat.
Okay, so talk us through that. How exactly did you go from carbon into something that's edible and ideally palatable?
So you'll have to bear with me because there's quite a lot of organic chemistry involved, because fats are one way that we can combine lots of hydrogen, carbon and oxygen atoms. In fact, that you could theoretically make synthetic foods for like synthetic carbohydrates, synthetic proteins, but fats are one of the easiest ones to start with. So that's why Savor has started there. So first you start with a source of carbon. Coal is one option, but instead of coal, Savor can use captured CO2 or natural gas as their source. And so that carbon gets processed into a synthesis gas, a syngas, which is a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. And then this gas goes through what is known as the Fischer-Tropsch process to convert that gas into hydrocarbons. So up to this point, this is all a pretty standard industrial process. We use it to make chemicals and fuels. And then what Savor does is they take some of these hydrocarbons and they oxygenate them to create fatty acids before adding glycerol to form triglycerides, which is a kind of pure form of fat. And then to turn that fat, the triglycerides, into butter, Savor adds some water and an emulsifier before finally adding some beta-carotene for that yellow colour that you expect butter to have. And the bit that I found interesting was that they then add rosemary oil because apparently that adds the grassy flavour that people expect from butter.
Not a classic recipe, I would say, not one I'd read in a cooking book. But, OK, does this stuff actually taste any good?
So here's the confession time. I haven't actually tasted it. Savor are based in San Francisco and I spoke to their chief technology officer in London at a conference, and the conference didn't allow any outside food in, so I couldn't try any of the samples. But Kathleen Alexander, the Savor CTO who I spoke to, does insist, and you probably would expect her to say this, but she says it tastes just like real butter. And in theory, to be fair, it probably should be quite close to at least the taste sensation of a fat because it's the same combination of molecules as you would find in normal fats. But the difference here is that we just haven't used any farming in the process. It's completely industrial.
Why do we need a carbon butter? What's the benefit when I can, shake a jar of cream into butter by hand with no industrial processes required?
Yeah, so I mentioned that climate change and biodiversity loss might be a reason why we want to think about having a carbon butter on our plates. We know by now that diets are a major driver of climate change, but it's not just the emissions from farting and burping cows that we need to worry about. It's the amount of land that we're using to produce food. About half of all the habitable land on Earth is being used for agriculture at the moment, which is pretty staggering. And that is coming at the cost of wild land like rainforests or peat bogs or meadows or savannas, like all these types of landscapes that actually would help us to tackle climate change and provide some space for biodiversity. So the thinking is that if we could just bypass the use of land for producing food, for some types of foods at least, like palm oil, which is often grown on deforested land, for example, then we could free up all of this land for better use.
And you had mentioned that, the idea of synthetic food could also extend to carbohydrates and proteins even. So is Savor looking to go past butter at any point?
Yeah, so they're looking specifically at fats because, as I said, they're the kind of easiest ones to start with. But they're not just thinking about butter. Theoretically, you could make kind of any type of fat using this process. The only reason they're starting with butter is because it's one of the more expensive types of fats. So they think they can launch this cost competitive with traditional butter on the market at the moment. But probably the most potential for this type of approach is for replacing other fat products such as palm oil, which is used in a huge range of foods and also not just foods, but lots of other consumer products and requires a huge amount of land, mostly in the tropical belt where rainforests should be.
So I've got to ask then, it's obviously animal-free, this synthetic fat, but is it actually better for the planet? Do we know that at this stage?
So Savor's team did team up with some researchers and they had a study published in the journal Nature last year that concluded that yes, synthetic fats could have a lower, almost half the carbon footprint of fats made using agricultural systems, assuming that the process is made using a sensible ecological approach, such as using captured carbon and you power it with renewables. The balance could tip the other way if you did something outlandish, like powered the process with coal-fired power plants. But the conclusion was that, yes, it could be a lower carbon alternative to traditional fats. And there's another interesting use. Not only could this be a kind of climate-friendly butter for your breakfast table, but this could also be a kind of disaster food because it's very shelf-stable. Savor says it's actually had quite a lot of interest from people working on food insecurity and resilience projects. So it could be coming to a nuclear bunker near you at some point. Although I should probably note that Savor are still working on getting FDA approval for their product, so we don't actually have a time frame for when it's available to buy.
Well, and I do wonder, people are becoming more mistrustful of things like ultra-processed foods, and industrial fats have a particularly controversial history. I mean, is that something we need to consider in this story?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really crucial point. Savor does seem pretty confident that it can make these kinds of fats at scale. After all, most of the technology is proven and already being used to different ends, but at scale. But I think the more pressing question is, will anyone actually want to eat this stuff?
All right, it's time for a quick break. And since we're on the theme of deliciousness this week, why not try eating a tiny black hole? Yes, this is a Dead Planet Society shout-out. Leah Crane and Chelsea White wanted to know what would happen. And if you tune in to this week's episode, you'll find out. That's already right there in your feed.
Plus, how about some lessons about beings that eat light? I'm obviously talking about plants. Zoe Schlanger's new book, The Light Eaters, is all about how our chlorophyll-rich friends sense and manipulate the world around them, and may even exhibit something like intelligence. Christy interviewed Zoe about this wonder-filled survey of an underappreciated kingdom of life, and that's going to be coming to you next Tuesday.
All over the world, the social and economic cost of brain disorders is growing. The challenge is so large that no single organisation or government can tackle it alone. But that's the challenge that the Brain Health Initiative aims to solve, and success could reap huge dividends. If you want to learn more about this initiative, read our New Scientist Collab feature sponsored by Roche that explores why we need to prioritise the global brain health crisis. Available at newscientist.com/Roche.
Next up, Google has set its sights on cracking that little old mystery of the origins of life. In a simulation dubbed a digital primordial soup, the company used computer code to recreate the randomness of early Earth. Little is known about how apparently inert and random molecules came together to produce life, but Google found that after millions of iterations of its digital primordial soup, the snippets of code it contained started to self-replicate, and artificial life emerged, despite there being no code instructing that outcome. What does this tell us about how we got here? Well, reporter Matt Sparks joins us with the details. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Tim.
So, Matt, talk us through this. What actually is a digital primordial soup, and what has that got to do with life?
So, although we know lots about evolution, how the first life evolved is a big mystery, and it's one that boils down to how does life, which is so complex, evolve from something comparatively simple, which is the soup of molecules out there in the environment. So Google's attempt at understanding this was to create a sort of digital primordial soup, which is a population of thousands of snippets of computer code, all initialized with utterly random gibberish. And those snippets then mingled for thousands of generations, swapping bits of code with each other, but with no rhyme or reason, no goals, and no sort of feedback process. And what they expected to see was just continued randomness forever and ever. But they were surprised to see that actually self-replicating programs cropped up and spread across the entire population, and also that subsequent replicators emerged that sort of competed for space with them.
It's really incredible. So it's not just that artificial life emerged here, it's also that it then evolved too, which is pretty wild and also kind of mysterious how that happened. Just trying to wrap my head around it all, is the implication from this, or at least the one they're trying to put forward, is that life just kind of emerges, given enough randomness and time, self-replication is kind of inevitable?
Yeah, that's one interpretation, and it's the one that Ben Laurie at Google ascribes to. He told me that it's not magic, it's just physics.
Nice, I like that. It all reminds me of some other attempts in computer science to look at how patterns emerge from randomness. Of course, this Conway's Game of Life is one of the most famous. But one question that always comes from these kind of experiments and simulations is, what does it actually have to do with biology? Did you ask any biologists what they made of it?
Yeah, I did, and they're not convinced at all, really.
Okay.
One biologist told me that the sort of complexity that these computer scientists are pointing out is not the same sort of complexity that gets biologists excited. Basically, self-replicating something over and over again is not enough to create life. It doesn't reveal how something could start building a genome and doing things other than self-replicating. But Laurie at Google says that if we were able to scale up the experiments enough and run them for long enough, then he thinks we'd eventually see complex organisms that build social structures, eat each other, invent cricket, start wars. The only problem with that is that we'd need computers so big that it's basically completely impractical to try. So it's unlikely that he'll ever back that assertion with any evidence.
Like, it feels like a really good start that something can replicate, but that's definitely a huge way off from explaining mammals, amphibians, and, even eukaryotic cells, on Earth.
Yeah, exactly. What we're getting from these experiments are little snippets of computer code that are able to repeat themselves. There's no other function going on. So on the one hand, that's really surprising because there was no guiding framework of rules or goals that led to that. But on the other hand, that is pretty basic stuff. Even bacteria are vastly more complex than that. But these sorts of experiments and all the neural network-based AI models that we're seeing so much of today, it's showing exciting behavior that we've not seen in computers before. So it's definitely an area to watch.
Up next, a new hormone discovered in mice may have solved a long-standing mystery about breastfeeding. And on the side of that, could even help us treat osteoporosis down the road. Health reporter Grace Wade is here with more. Hey, Grace.
Hi, thanks for having me.
All right, so Grace, tell us about this discovery. Why are we talking about bones and breastfeeding in the same breath?
Well, researchers found a hormone that strengthens bones, and it's only produced by lactating female mice. And this may explain how mammals, like us, are able to maintain strong bones when breastfeeding, which is a question researchers have puzzled over for decades.
And why was that such a perplexing question? Like, why is anyone asking about bones during breastfeeding, in the first place?
Yeah, I had that same thought as well. But when people breastfeed, the body strips calcium from bones to produce milk. And calcium is a main building block of bone. Breastfeeding also lowers estrogen, which is a hormone critical for maintaining bone mass. All of this would suggest that bone should rapidly deteriorate during lactation, but that's actually not the case. In fact, it only slightly and temporarily decreases.
And so the idea is that this hormone could be the missing link. How did the researchers actually find it?
Almost by accident. So about 5 years ago, researchers at the University of California, San Francisco were conducting research in mice about something completely different. And they discovered that blocking certain estrogen receptors in the brain's hypothalamus caused female mice to have really, really dense bones. This was a big surprise because, as I said, estrogen is essential for maintaining bone mass. So the researchers who had no experience studying bones before this set out to figure out why that was. And after 5 years of trial and error, they found that a hormone called CCN3 was strengthening the animal's bones. And it was only produced in female mice during lactation. This suggests CCN3 is what keeps bones strong while breastfeeding.
I feel like there's so many discoveries that happen by accident like that. It's really amazing. Hard to generate such happenstance like that. But presumably knowing about this hormone, that could be useful beyond just us understanding the human body better. Are there some applications of it?
Definitely. One of the most exciting aspects of this discovery is it could lead to new ways of treating or even preventing osteoporosis, which is a condition that causes bones to become weak and brittle. Very few treatment options are available to strengthen bones in osteoporosis, so this hormone could be a game changer. The researchers were able to show it accelerates bone recovery in older male mice. They applied a patch containing CCN3 to bone fractures in the mice, and after 3 weeks, the animal's bone volume increased almost 250% more than in animals that weren't treated with the patch.
That is a really incredible effect, and I can't wait to see what happens with this research, but I do have to ask, with my little, mice aren't people protest sign waving around, how translatable is all of this to humans? Can we actually help humans who have osteoporosis?
Yeah, I need to get a button with that slogan because it's always the big question, right? But the researchers are optimistic these findings will translate to people because lactation is quite similar between mice and humans. But to really answer that question, we need to show that people who are breastfeeding produce CCN3. The researchers are currently working to develop a blood test that does just that.
Christy, I learned something really quite surprising this week that I'd like to share with you.
All right, my knuckles are cracked. I'm ready.
Did you know that your pupils change size when you breathe in and out, and they dilate bigger and then shrink throughout the course of just a breath cycle?
Wow. Okay, so they don't just get bigger and smaller based on, light or, maybe sometimes health conditions?
Yeah, that's right. So now I have to say we've known for decades that breathing affects pupil size, but previous research, somewhat surprisingly, was done with cats and wrongly claimed that human pupils are largest during inhalation and smallest during exhalation. Well, a team has finally looked at some human pupils, and it turns out we're different to cats. Like, who
Really?
knew? Yeah, we have
Who
different
knew?
eyes. Who knew?
Who knew?
Surprisingly, though, it is quite a tiny change. Our pupils are smallest when we begin to breathe in, and then they increase in size steadily through the entire inhale. And then in the beginning of the exhale, then when we reach the middle of our exhale, they very rapidly shrink back to their original size. It's quite a beautiful little cycle that happens.
Yeah, I was about to say that sounds like a lovely dance. I have a lot of questions. Like, does it matter how people breathed? Why does this happen? Is it useful to our bodies somehow that, our pupils go bloop, bloop, bloop?
You have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions. The researchers have a lot of questions. So do
Everyone
cats.
has questions.
Everyone's got questions about this. But we don't actually have that many answers at this point. So one answer we do have is that, first off, no, it didn't matter if people breathed in through their nose or mouth. That seems to not affect it at all. But for everything else, we don't really know why this happens or if it might confer some benefit. It's one of those kind of unsatisfying, more research needed moments.
All right, you've got a surprising fact. I've got a weird set of words that I didn't imagine I'd be saying this week. But one way we may be able to protect financial markets from GPS jamming involves cosmic rays from outer space.
Okay, so you might have to break this one down for me, because I didn't know financial markets needed GPS as the base premise of this fact. But then also I can't really imagine what cosmic rays have to do with it either.
Right, yeah. Those are all things I learned this week, too. Basically, financial markets like the New York Stock Exchange involve traders making large numbers of transactions per second. But in order to do this in a way that doesn't, break the economy, they rely on computers that are extremely well synchronized in time, like down to the nanosecond. So, all these computers are sort of agreeing about what time it is while they're doing their high throughput financial transactions. And currently, financial firms use servers that are synchronized by GPS and other satellites for this purpose. Again, down to the nanosecond. That's something GPS can do. But as we've discussed in other contexts, GPS is vulnerable to spoofing or jamming.
So that's the GPS and the financial markets. Cosmic rays, where do they fit in?
Right. A cosmic ray is a very high energy blast from outside the solar system. They hit us a lot. And basically, when a cosmic ray hits the Earth's atmosphere, it creates high-energy particles called muons that then fall down to the surface. These muons are something we can detect. And if you scatter a bunch of muon detectors around, say, again, the New York Stock Exchange, and you assign every sort of muon detection event a time code, you are now able to get a really reliable indicator of an objective event in time. And that was that cosmic ray impact. Then what you do is you create a network of computers that all agree about what time it is. You have an accuracy of less than 150 nanoseconds, which is very acceptable for financial transactions. And this whole sort of system may be even cheaper than some of the other ways we're currently synchronizing financial markets.
Wow, that's really cool. And I guess if we're talking comparisons to GPS, it's also pretty hard to get GPS signals inside buildings, whereas high-energy particles, they can go wherever they want.
Yeah, that too. The research team says this muon detection system needs to be tested for stability over, longer periods of time than it currently has been tested. But if it, proves to be something that can be stable for, a year or more, it may also be useful for applications underwater, underground. And again, it's resistant to spoofing and jamming, which was the original goal.
Very nice. All right, one final one. You know how early Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals?
Right. And now genetic researchers are doing all this work to figure out what traits those of us with Neanderthal DNA might be able to thank them for.
Yeah, exactly. Well, ancient Homo sapiens also interbred with the Denisovans, and they're that group of humans that lived in eastern Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their DNA shows up mostly in indigenous people of Oceania. And new research of different groups of people in Papua New Guinea is suggesting that Denisovan DNA may have helped them adapt to living at high elevations, or even the immune challenges of living in a malaria hotspot.
Oh, that's cool. So how exactly can researchers know this? What is the process of looking at someone's DNA, finding some Denisovan genes, and then concluding that they're useful?
So Papua New Guinea is a place with a lot of elevation changes. There are the lowlands, about 100 meters above sea level, and the highlands, where people may live over 2,500 meters above sea level. And the researchers sequenced the genomes of more than 120 people living at these different elevations, and what they found was that there were Denisovan gene variants found only in the highlands that appear associated with early brain development, which may help highland-dwelling people cope with the risk of hypoxia, which they may have given there's less available oxygen at high altitudes.
What about the lowlanders? Like, what about, are there genes there that seem useful to them?
Yeah, so for the lowlanders, they found that other Denisovan gene variants at much higher frequencies, so namely those associated with immune proteins. And these are proteins that Homo sapiens also have genes for, but immune systems function best with variety. So having the Denisovan version of genes for immune system response is probably really helpful, especially because malaria is really, really common in the lowlands of Papua New Guinea, but not at all in the highlands.
Truly, we get by with a little help from our early human friends. Wow, amazing.
Yeah. Have I ever told you my favourite Denisovan fact?
No.
So,
is this a
joke,
or is this a...
No, this is true. So
okay.
They're called the Denisovans because of Denisova Cave in Russia or wherever it is. But it's called Denisova Cave because there used to be a hermit called Dennis who lived there.
Dennis!
So they're all called. There's there's mysterious ancient people are all named after a hermit called Dennis.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's it for this week. If you like this show and think more people should know about us, please do give us a 5-star rating or even a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
We've got more fascinating stories from New Scientist on our website at newscientist.com, where we have frozen and jerkified the news so that its DNA can be easily extracted thousands of years from now. We'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.
This podcast is produced by OG Podcasts. Find out more at ogpodcasts.co.uk.